Hey, you're listening to the On Humans podcast, and here is a little bonus episode as a short epilogue to the 5-part brain series of the past couple of months. This is a clip from the conversation I had with the head of Oxford's biology department, Tim Coulson. So that conversation was part of the Origins of Humankind series, and indeed, for most of the conversation, we talked about the origins of humanity. This is about the science and philosophy of free will. So not quite on theme, therefore did not make the cut there, but I have been thinking about releasing it ever since as a standalone, and I thought that this was as good of a time as any. I'm someone who did my undergrad in philosophy and psychology, so there was a time when I thought about these kind of things all the time. I don't think about questions like free will so much nowadays, but it was interesting to revisit. It was almost nostalgic to revisit these topics with an Oxford professor of all. That was where I did my undergrad. As you will hear, we are in this conversation very much running up against the clock. So yeah, here we go in a very, very tightly packed 15 minutes exploring one of the greatest questions at the intersection of modern philosophy and science, which is this. You chose to listen to this episode, but could you have chosen otherwise? Let's hear from Tim Coulson. Enjoy. So, free will, consciousness, God. Let's start with free will. You think that science has not disproven free will. And I think that if I'm right, there's two pillars in your argument. One is that you discuss the origin of maybe what we might call will as such in the origin of movement. In that when the first animals were able to move, they had to, there's a line in your book about how this meant that they had to learn to make choices. And therefore we can make choices today. But then there's of course, the big question, but hold on a second. Could we have chosen otherwise? Isn't it dictated by the deterministic laws of physics? And here you turn to your reading of the best physics we have, as saying that there's no strong reason to believe that the universe is deterministic. First of all, is that a correct way of kind of sketching out your argument around free will?
Yeah, so there's two camps here, and I'll explain the reason for them. So there are some physicists who propose arguments of kind of superdeterminism, and those arguments are that the universe is deterministic. And if we had the ability to, we would, and the knowledge, we would be able to track the behavior of every single particle in the universe and every interaction that particle gets involved in. And we'd need a computer the size of the universe to do it, but we would, in principle, be able to perfectly predict exactly how everything in the universe pans out.
And if you would rerun the universe by some magic, it would turn out the same.
If you had exactly the same starting conditions, it would end up in the same outcome. And the alternative to that is that there is some chance, there's some randomness or stochasticity that's there. And that if we were to do that experiment, we wouldn't be here having the conversation, or we might only be here on 7% of occasions. You then have to ask the question is, well, where does chance come from? Okay, so where does randomness come from? Because physics, certainly physics on the macro scale, is very predictable. We understand the laws of nature. We understand the behavior of large objects. So you then ask the question, where does randomness come from? And the only possible source of true randomness that we know of in the universe is the behavior of very tiny particles, and that's known as quantum behavior. And that's where particles behave as waves, as wave functions, but also as point particles. And in fact, every object in the universe, including the universe itself, has something called a wavelength associated with it. And if our wavelength is tiny, it's about a billionth of a millimeter, so we can ignore it. But tiny particles have wavelengths that are much larger than them, and that's why we can't pinpoint them and explain where they are. And so the question then becomes, if the only source of randomness in the universe is at the quantum level, so what's going on with tiny particles, how does that scale up to give us the ability to make choices and the ability to have free will? Yeah, and there's a lot of research in a field called quantum biology, which tries to work out, does biology use quantum behavior? And we know it does for things like photosynthesis. So the answer to that is yes. Photosynthesis on the electron transfer chain uses the quantum behavior of electrons in order to run effectively and efficiently. And there's a debate that's been going on for some time about where else quantum behavior might influence biology. There has been some research out of the University of Surrey relatively recently, which argues that some genetic mutations are caused by quantum fluctuations, quantum events. So that would suggest that then the evolution of life is random. And there's some work out there saying that consciousness itself and the way that brains work uses quantum behavior of particles. Now, that's far from proven.
But it's a possibility, yeah. And by the way, I think that maybe we should notice that there are three questions here, actually. One is whether quantum mechanics is actually random. And as you point out in the book, there are people who believe in the many worlds interpretation, for example, who believe that there's a sense in which it's not really random. Everything that could happen happens, and then the universe is split. So if you would run the universe again, you would have the same branch of universes.
So quantum behavior is true. There's no doubt about that. It's science's most successful theory. There's no doubt about that as well. What the challenge is on the interpretation of quantum mechanics. And some physicists have tried to come up with ways to turn that what appears as random into deterministic. And one of them is the many worlds theory, which says everything that can happen does happen, but we only experience one reality.
So there's another Tim somewhere not having this conversation.
There's another Tim that's in a slightly different universe. There's one where I'm ruler of the universe, and the one where I died as a baby. All of this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
It's a nice hypothesis. It's completely untestable at the moment. So it's nothing more than wishful thinking.
I think that's important to notice here, not because it means it's not true, but it means that there's no scientific reason now to refute the alternatives.
That's right.
And one of the major alternatives is that, well, that's just what the universe is like. There is the famous Einstein saying that God doesn't play dice, and Niels Bohr saying don't tell God what to do. And so if we take the Niels Bohr side, we do have genuine randomness at the quantum level.
Yeah. Now, my view is, I think the, Occam's razor, so take the most simple explanation, is that what goes on in the quantum world is stochastic. It is random. That would be my argument. So I believe, and it is because I'm a biologist, I think I work with stochastic systems or random systems all the time. And it's a hunch. I can't prove it. And I don't like, and this isn't scientific at all. It's a personal view. I don't like the idea that free will is an illusion. I don't see why it would have evolved as an illusion. I don't see why we would be conscious. There'd be no need for it. But yeah.
Well, I guess the what I was thinking when I said that there are three things here is, one is the question of whether quantum mechanics is really deterministic. The second question is, does that influence biology?
Yeah.
And you mentioned that there is evidence that it does at times, and it might very well do when it comes to, for example, our choices. I might actually add one thing to that, which I don't know if you have any comments on this, but I'm a little bit frustrated sometimes when in this discussion, it's always about quantum biology, which is really, really fascinating. But isn't there an easier path? Isn't there the pure path of noise? Because heat creates noise, and heat is I mean, the kind of, the textbook example is heat is a little bit like you have a lot of balloons in a room, and the faster they move, the more heat there is. And biology happens in places where there's, the room temperature has quite a lot of this random Brownian motion. And if you do take quantum mechanics seriously, well, you cannot possibly measure exactly what is happening in Brownian motion, because those balls don't have a specific place where they are in.
But the argument is, actually, if we were able, if we were able to work out the rules of the universe you get to a point where quantum mechanics becomes deterministic. You end up being able to explain what looks like random behavior. Then you would be able to predict the movement of particles.
100%. But what I thought was that if you do buy into the quantum mechanics is random or has randomness, and the Heisenberg uncertainty principle that a particle does not have clear location speed at a particular moment, then I don't know if you even need a fancy quantum biology where to say that there must be some randomness in biology just because of heat. But let's move on. I guess the third question then is, well, is this enough for free will? And there are people who would say, well, hold on a second, that's not what I want. I don't want my decisions to be forced by the laws of physics. But neither do I want them to be completely random. I want me to be in charge. I want a third option. I don't want necessity or chance. And to the extent that it's a God playing dice, so to speak, that's not free will. That's not my will. That's just randomness. And that's a third option. And therefore, there is still no space for free will. How do you think about that argument?
So I think it all literally boils down to if what goes on at the quantum level is truly random, free will can exist, and I believe it does exist. I believe we have choices. We are not completely determined by our genes. Our genes give us proclivities to do things. Yes, they interact with the environment to determine how we develop. There's no doubt about that. But there's still apparent randomness in the way that we develop. So, identical twins don't have exactly the same neuronal structures in their brains, and that's because tiny little kind of neural tiny little molecular tractors that drag neurons into place when the brain's developing. There's some variation that goes on there, some randomness, which means that even genetically identical twins have different brain structures. But yes, we do have, genes are important, environment is important, but we do have a choice. We do have chance, in my opinion. I believe that we will come up and we will reach the conclusion that quantum behavior is random, and that somehow life is using that, and that feeds through to allow us to make choices. But the types of choice that we make and the types of decisions we make are determined to some extent by our past experience and by our genes. So there are some people that are clearly more cautious than others in terms of decisions they make, and others that are less cautious. Some of that comes from genes, some of that comes from experience. But I believe we have free choice and free will.
And I think what was an interesting link I saw in your book is that on the one hand, there is this question of, is it just chance? But if it's just chance, it's not free will. Is it just forced by the laws? But if it's really deterministic and forced, then it's not free will. It's somewhere in the middle. That actually reminded me of what you said in your chapter on the evolution of consciousness. That interestingly, if you look at the brain signature of an awake, conscious human, it actually is somewhere in between being completely random and being completely predictable. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. When we're awake and we're thinking and we're doing things like this, we see patterns of brain waves that have some structure to them, but we can't predict them perfectly. If you're unconscious, you're in a coma, your brain waves are much more random, and you have no recollection of being in that coma. You have no recollection that time has passed when you come out of the coma. Ditto for some types of hallucinogenic drugs. And if your brainwaves become too ordered, you also are not as conscious at the same degree of consciousness as you are now, because you're a little bit constrained. So consciousness is, and we measure consciousness actually by those patterns in brainwaves when you go into a hospital. It's one of the ways we work out whether you're dead or still alive, or whether you're brain dead or not.
Okay, well, this has been amazing. Thanks so much. I did mention that you also talk about God, and I wanted to get there. We don't have time to get to God today. Maybe we should do this another time.
I don't believe in God, but I don't want to try and persuade anyone else to have their own view. That's not the point, right? My point is to try and understand what science can say. And God and religion are important for some people. And the last thing, I know I'm not going to change anyone's mind, and they're not going to change my mind, so.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a good way to finish that. But then I do have my final question, which I always finish the conversations with, and that is, how has all your research and writing this book, how has it shaped your outlook on humanity?
I mean, we are a remarkable species. There's no doubt about this. We are, I think it was Carl Sagan who said, we are the universe's way of appreciating its magnificence, or words to that effect. I think, whether there's intelligent life or other planets is, something that, is an interesting thing to talk about. But as far as we're aware, we're the only, as far as, we were discovered, we're the only species that has the intelligence to understand how the universe works. And I can't believe I'm alive and a person who's alive at this time where science has made such astonishing progress. It's absolutely remarkable how physics, chemistry, biology, anthropology, consciousness research has taken us on a journey of understanding how we got here. And I'm, I loved writing the book. I hope people will read it and enjoy it, because I've not only I'm now on a podcast to do when I'm talking to you about humans and where did humans come from. Last night I was talking about the role of the cosmos and the emergence of life. So, and it's just wonderful to be able to have thought about all of these things and the breakthroughs of science and try and link it together. I'm sure I've made mistakes. I'm sure I haven't got it all right, but what a privilege it is for us to be human and alive now, and to be able to think about these things, and for there to be so much knowledge to dive into. And it's been an absolute joy talking to you. Thank you very much for having me on. I've loved every minute of it.